Great. Welcome, everybody. It's wonderful to see all of you. My name is Faria Khan. I'm the co-director of the Asian American Studies program, and it's great that you could all join us for the third installment of our Asian American Studies Fellows Colloquium. And today we have Lily Suh talking. But before we do that, I just wanted to do a few shameless Asian American Studies plugs. One, as you probably all know, advanced registration begins next week. And so I encourage you to go on our website to look at some of the new course offerings that we will be offering in the spring. We'll have two new courses, one with a brand new professor. Dr. Stephanie George will be joining us. She will be teaching a new course called Sonic Reverberations of Asian America, an ethnomusicology course, and that's a first for us. So we're very, very excited to host her. She actually will be coming next week to talk a little bit about her course on November 4th, and I hope many of you will be able to join us. That's a 4 p.m. conversation right here. So do put that on your calendar. We will also be hosting a new course that I'm teaching called American Race, a Philadelphia story that will look broadly at race as an interdisciplinary phenomenon. And then we'll be bringing in local perspectives from Philadelphia. So as we discuss race thematically, we will then look at community activists that are doing the work on race in Philadelphia right now. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to talk with you about that as well. So as we talk about courses, of course, I want to also mention our minor, which is an easy, life-changing 6 courses. And so I wanted to just pass this around because it gives you information about the minor. If you are interested or have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me. I'm happy to walk through that with you or answer any questions. Okay, so I think Joyce is beyond the minor. Sorry, you're beyond the minor. Yeah. You know, take a look at that and please share it with your friends who may be considering it as well. Okay. So the last thing I want to say before I turn it over to Lily, and I'm so sorry, but please stay tuned for several new exciting things happening in Asian American Studies next semester as we celebrate our 25th anniversary. We have launched a brand new podcast, which will give you so much information about the program and our university, actually. So have a listen to that. We'll be having a large conference and gala in March. We will be launching a speaker series with alumni. So really wonderful things to come. So please stay tuned. Okay. So finally, I will stop talking. I'm so sorry. And turn it over to Lily. Lily is a sophomore and considering majoring in English and minoring in Asian American Studies. So also Lily would be a wonderful contact if you have any questions about that. Lily's actively involved in the Asian American Studies community here at Penn. Not only is Lily a fellow in the Asian American Fellows program, but also serves as an undergraduate advisory board. We're very grateful for all of the work that she does. So I will turn it over to Lily to talk to us about the American Dream. And the title of her talk is, and the research that she's done since the summer of 2021 is the unraveling of the American Dream across Korean migration narratives. So join me in welcoming Lily. Thank you so much.
So much, Dr. Khan. As you said, my name is Lily Suh. I use she, her pronouns. So today I'm going to talk to you about the American Dream. So here's a roadmap. So I'm starting with how I started this project, some of my research questions, and methodology, and then I'm going to dive into the 2 sections of my research, which is the Korean American literature that I investigated, also family interviews, and then I'm going to end with my next steps. All right, so I got interested in this area because it's very relevant to me. I was always really curious about my own history, but really felt unsatiated by the curriculum I had throughout high school. through my adolescence, the only books I read by Asian American authors were through my own independent reading time. It wasn't until I reached college and took a class with Dr. Ang's on Intro to Asian American Literature where I read a book by an Asian American author in class and examined it through an academic perspective. This project's also largely inspired by a class I took with Dr. Khan last semester called Asian American Communities. I had the opportunity to interview my maternal grandparents for a project. And this was really illuminating because I had the opportunity to talk to them about topics where I never really felt comfortable asking them at the dinner table. I think that it was really cathartic for them to be able to share some really deeply personal things that maybe they didn't feel comfortable bringing up to their children and their grandchildren on their own. So I think this project really allowed me to get to know my family deeper, but also for my family to deeply examine things about themselves that maybe they hadn't had the opportunity to do so before. Right. So how I wanted to research how Korean migration narratives are portrayed in literature, and also how different generations of immigrants engage with the American dream. So I thought the best way to find this out was to look at how Korean migration narratives were portrayed in literature. So I started by reading these 8 books. So I read Free Food for Millionaires by Lee, and I'll be focusing on that for the purposes of this presentation. But I'll also be touching on Minor Feelings by Kathleen Park Hong and Dicte by Teresa Hakim Shaw. And this is a picture of my family when they first immigrated. So we can see my grandma, who I'll be referring to as Hanbuni, which is Korean for grandmother, and my Hanabuchi, which is Korean for grandfather. To the left, you can see my Uncle Chris, who's the oldest sibling, and then the middle child, my Uncle Brian in the glasses, and then in the middle is my mother, Kelly, who is the youngest child. So here I'm going to be looking into Free Food for Millionaires. So a lot of you might be familiar with this author. She wrote Pachinko, if any of you are familiar with that book. So in this book, the main character is named Casey Khan. I think a lot of us can relate to her because she's an Ivy League graduate. I think this book really drew me in because it was the first time where I read a book that was centered on an angry Asian American. I feel like that's really missing from the media largely. And so Casey's grappling with what she wants to be, what she wants to pursue in life, as she tries to balance the stability that her parents really wish for her and her own ambitions and passions, which are more risk-taking. So I think that a lot of people resonate with her because she does feel very suppressed by the expectations of her. And I think that in a lot of ways you can look at her and be like, she is the result of the American dream. She is college educated from an Ivy League, but I think also we can look at her and she feels, very rebellious. She does things that she's not supposed to, which very much go against the American dream. And I think that this book was really interesting because it shows the wedge growing between her and her parents, because of the sacrifices her parents made in order for her to achieve this life that she lives. She feels like a lot of her success, is indebted to her parents in a way that she doesn't want to feel. So there's a lot of tension that results from Casey's father shaming her by bringing up all of the sacrifices that he made in order to secure her success. So the first quote I'm touching on is, his losses weren't hers and she didn't want to hold them. She was in Queens and it was 1993. But at the table, it was 1953 and the Korean War refused to end. So after Casey's parents were forced to sacrifice so much when they came to America, they're unable to leave, recently so, the trauma that they experienced overseas. For example, Casey's father was born very wealthy, but he lost his money and a lot of his family during the Korean War, and he was unable to go to college. He was a war refugee, and then he immigrated to America with his children. So, instead of her parents being able to neatly package away this trauma, it continues to leak into their children's lives. So there's the burden of Casey not wanting to hold her parents' trauma, but there's also the continued trauma from the Korean War that it's impossible to quietly pack away for them to resolve without speaking about it openly. I think this then leads to the second quote. It was arrogant, perhaps rash, for an immigrant girl from the boroughs to want to choose their own trade. Nevertheless, Casey wasn't ready to relinquish her dream, however big, for a secure profession. So I think this quote really illustrates the tension between the American dream and personal dreams. It's deemed unreasonable for this girl to pursue a career that doesn't ensure a secure future without, but I think also it shows how like the American dream does not guarantee a strugglerless future even if you do engage with it. Casey is in pursuit of the American dream also because her parents were dry cleaners and she wishes to escape that life and achieve some economic but also social mobility. But I think she's also suffocated by the fact that this achievement demands the sacrifice of her own personal will, which she's unwilling to sacrifice. So for Casey's parents, they demand her economic stability, and they also wish that she would have taken advantage of the opportunities granted to her from graduating from Princeton, but she's also unwilling to, succumb to her white peers and, scratch their back in order to get ahead of her Asian community. So I think that this book is really interesting, and it really showed how, that struggle between going ahead but also sacrificing your own personal freedom in order to fit this small minority. So now I'm going to shift to the section of my research about my interviews with my family. So I'm going to open with a quote from Minor Feelings by Kathy Parch Hong. And she talks about how when the Korean War ended, the West had much better conditions, which caused everyone to want to immigrate to America. So she says, when Korean immigrants had immigrated here, they didn't simply travel spatially, but through time, traveling 3 generations into the future. So like many other immigrants, my grandparents did not just travel to America for their own sake, but they were looking at their non-existent grandchildren at the time. They were thinking of my parents' education. They were thinking of their kids' futures. Immediately after asking my grandparents why they immigrated, my family immediately responded it was for her kids' education. So my grandparents immigrated in 1978 when they were both 38, and their kids were 9, 8, and 6. So very young. So with this forward thinking, they followed in pursuit of a better life outside of this rebuilding Korea. And also, I think that the question of the American dream is incredibly entangled with the trauma that immigrants face when they're leaving their native countries. So a really challenging part of my research was talking to my grandparents about their experience during the Korean War. My grandparents existed in an incredibly poor Korea that I can't really imagine because I look at Korea now and I think of this K-pop and hyper romanticized cultural hotspot. So it's so interesting and tragic to see how much it's changed in these past decades, and to think that my grandparents now live in this vastly different world and had to go through the horrors of the Korean War. So when I asked my grandparents about what they remember from the Korean War, my Haiwani really quietly said a lot. They remember a lot. So they were both 10 when the Korean War occurred. So they were young, but also they remember a lot. The Korean War began in 1950. My Taiwanese family is actually originally from North Korea, but they happened to be living in Seoul at the time. And I thought that since they're living in Seoul, they would be safe, but actually they both had to migrate further down south in order to escape the bombings. So both my grandparents told me a lot of horrific stories. One of them is my grandmother, my Haiwani, was she and her 7 other siblings had to have money sewn into their clothing in case they got separated from their parents. I can't imagine a third or fourth grader having my parents sew money into my pockets in order to secure my safety in the future if I ever lost them. Another one was my Haiwani when she was moving south. She and her family rode on top of trains to get down south. It's incredibly dangerous. And as a child with 7 other siblings, I can't even imagine. So throughout this retelling, my grandparents kept on vocalizing how sad it was, and taking moments to pause, because I think that for them, it requires a lot of pause in order to tell such traumatic memories. So throughout this interview process, I wanted to illustrate how the notion of the American dream continues to adapt to appeal to new immigrant groups, yet it's simultaneously disproven by the lived experiences by immigrants. So to many Americans, the American dream is a vision where everyone in the United States, regardless of class or position, can achieve success and enjoy a quality of life better than their parents if they're willing to work hard. So to my grandparents, I think it means a very similar thing. Through the American dream, if you work as hard as you can, and with this hard work, you can rise through the ranks and achieve security in America. So through their struggles in America, I think they can look back now and see that through clinging to the American dream, they are now financially stable Americans who have achieved the American dream. I'll touch on that a little bit later as I talk about how my generation views the American dream. But next, I wanted to interview my Uncle Chris, Uncle Brian, and my mom. So in terms of how my Uncle Brian thought my grandparents would define the American dream, he said, I think they would define the American dream as primarily for the success of their kids. I think it was very much a sacrificial one, where they subjugated their personal kinds of success financially, as long as it be a foundation for us to be successful. I think in some ways, their American dream was very much based on this Confucian ethos of passing on to your children what you can and allowing their success to be your success. So while speaking to my uncle, he really noted how the theme of my grandparents' life was struggle and sacrifice. You know, as a member of such a closely knit family, I, as a granddaughter, am still very close to my grandparents. There's this really unavoidable tension of indebtedness that one has to your immigrant parents, and I guess by extension, my immigrant grandparents, which plays out in various ways of life. Because my grandparents were perpetually saving money because they didn't have much of a safety net here in America. My mom and her siblings were kind of forced to pursue financially stable jobs. Both my uncles ended up being doctors, and my mom ended up being a teacher. But some of the stories, like my uncle Brian, he wanted to go to film school his freshman year of college, but my family immediately shut it down. I remember my uncle Chris saying it was a fleeting moment in his college career. Or my uncle Chris, when he was at Stanford for medical school, he had the opportunity to join Yahoo before they knew it would be Yahoo. And he had a lot of discussions with my grandparents, and they ultimately decided it was not going to happen for him. You know, I think that they all look back at their lives and are very happy and content with where we are as a family and where they are now in their life. But I don't think they really ever had to choose the choice but to choose these extremely stable lifestyles. So when I was talking to my mom and her siblings, it was really clear that they still believed in the American dream, but I think there was a little bit more of a nuanced understanding. They knew that it was not as accessible to all groups of people, but they still think that they achieved it, and also my grandparents did. So now here's all my cousins. There are 9 of us total. So in order to see how my generation interacted with the American dream, I interviewed my cousins and my siblings. I have 2 sisters. So I was really excited in particular to see how my older sister, Anna, would respond to my questions, since she is almost done college and is the most like an adult out of all of us. So to Anna, the American dream was the idea of social mobility, but also membership into the national body. And the idea that the American dream has a clear start and end point, and a clear trajectory that's seamless and unquestioned, where at the end you're delivered into American citizenship. And to Anna, she said, I don't think that the American dream is an attainable thing. I think maybe aspects of it are attainable, but I don't think it's simple either. You can just look at the American dream as getting from point A to point B by making money. But the American dream is disrupted by the different privileges that different groups are afforded and the different conditions that allow for different individuals to move up. So I think that I can look at my grandparents and I see that they've achieved this financial mobility, but I would argue that my grandparents never achieved the social mobility that is also an integral piece of the American dream. You know, most of their friends and community are all in the Korean like church community. They speak in Korean to each other. My grandparents, they don't really interact much with the outside white community in New Jersey that they're also a part of. So I think that I noticed this intergenerational shift in the perspective of the American dream because my generation is privileged enough to be able to think critically about this concept in ways that my grandparents were unable to do so. I'm shielded by citizenship, American birth. So my generation is able to engage with white society without a language barrier and the ability to educate ourselves. I mean, I want to minor in Asian American studies. That's something my grandparents would never have been able to do in their time. And even my parents, it's a relatively new program. So like many immigrants, my grandparents were extremely busy when they first immigrated to America. They had 3 young kids, a new business, and a farmland. I don't think they really had the chance to unpack all the trauma that they experienced in this transcontinental move, because they're so fixated on survival. But I think that my generation is very lucky because I don't have to fight to survive. I have the luxury of knowing that I have the safety net. I have my family in America. So I'm very thankful that I'm able to take a step back through this project and process the experiences that have shaped my family members and then by extension myself. So my grandparents worked very hard to create a better life for themselves and myself. And they've persevered in order to provide my family the life that we have now. And is currently unfolding. But I think that their American citizenship does not mean that the American dream has fully accepted them or the grandchildren. And their hard work and sacrifice definitely do not exempt my family from facing xenophobia or hardships, which I think that a lot of people in this room can relate to, particularly during this COVID-19 time. But I do think that I owe a lot of thanks to my grandparents for opening a lot of opportunities to me I would never, ever have access to without their sacrifices. So I want to end with this quote from Dictate by Teresa Hak-Chung-Cha. She says, "Why resurrect it all now from the past? History, the old wound. The past emotions all over again. To confess, to relive the same folly, to name it now so as not to repeat history in oblivion. To extract each fragment by fragment from the word, from the image, another word, another image, the reply that will not repeat history in oblivion." Throughout this project, I often paused and I wondered if I was doing the right thing. Was it fair for me to ask my 8-year-old grandparents to relive some of the trauma that they experienced as 10-year-olds? I periodically heard my grandparents note how sad the Korean War was and how sad their life was in Korea. So I wondered if I was being a little too intrusive, if I was checking my elder grandparents too much. But I think that these lines from Dictate really show why it's really important to investigate their past. It's not through single conversations, but through extracting each fragment by fragment in order to string together my family's history. It saddens me to think that my grandparents lived through such an incredibly horrific, sad, horrible period in history. But I think that this naming of the past is extremely important. Even though in this world we're bound to make the same errors and repeat history, I think it's important that the history is acknowledged so it isn't forgotten. I would never want everything that my grandparents went through to be forgotten. So now that I've learned this, I want to investigate more about intergenerational trauma. I think that we witness this trauma in the Asian community through what is not said, through silences. And I want to delve further into this. I want to continue to interview my grandparents and learn more about their past, particularly in Korea. So I set out to answer how Korean migration narratives were portrayed in literature and how the American dream interacts with different immigrant generations by reading Korean American literature and interviewing my family. And I discovered that the American dream does not translate to real life as it is promised to immigrants by white society. Thank you for attending my talk. Are there any questions?
Thank you so much. Does anyone have any questions? Or thoughts or comments? Yeah.
Thank you, Lily. I mean, it was so interesting to hear you talk about like the literature that you were reading and also those like connections to when you interviewed your family. But there was one part where you said that you had like never really talked about these things to your family members before, like in general, like at the dinner table. So how did you make that jump to suddenly like introducing these conversations with them in case, because I feel like that's also something that like I would like to like have those conversations with like family members and maybe like others in the room. So if you have any advice on that.
Yeah, I think I'm very fortunate. Thank you for your question. I am very close to my family, and I know that as I've gotten older, and in particular my sisters, as we have, as a nuclear family, have gotten more mature, we've been curious and we've been wanting to ask my parents more. So we have broached those topics at the dinner table. I think definitely with like my extended family, like my uncles, my grandparents, like I don't see them very much throughout the year, particularly with my uncles. I see them like during Thanksgiving and during the summer. We that time is spent like in playful, joyful conversations. But I'm very lucky that they felt open to these conversations when I talked to them. I think that they both were very earnest to tell me their stories. So I think just I told them that they were able to set boundaries if they ever felt uncomfortable answering something. I think that making them feel safe is also important because they're also being vulnerable with you. And I think my grandparents, like my husband, kept joking, like, "Are we done yet? Like, is this the last question?" But I think that they want to share. I think that everyone wants to be heard and understood. I think it's just about kind of opening the floor for them to their own comfort level. Like I had a lot of conversations with Dr. Kalai and Dr. Khan, and they said that, this is not just a single conversation. This can be over multiple interviews. And so it doesn't even have to be an interview with you and your family. It can be an open dialogue.
Thank you.
No, I just was gonna follow up with, how you did an amazing job navigating these conversations. I'm so touched hearing you speak about your grandparents and your family and then seeing the photos. I mean, it's incredibly powerful. But, the sensitivity with which you have brought the work to your family and then the ways that they have shared that is such a gift. And I'm thrilled to know that you're going to continue some of this work as well. And, I remember your other work where, there was a lovely pizza story. I don't know if you have a minute to share that because I think it's so cute. But, I think that is not easy, right? I don't know if you wanted to talk a little bit about that, but the difficulties in doing this work too, that it hasn't just been like 5 minutes of work. You've been actually doing this for over a year.
I can share the pizza story quickly. This is a story from my maternal grandparents. So similarly to my maternal grandparents, they immigrated to America, but instead of with 3 children, it was just my dad. So he was 3 years old when they immigrated, and they immigrated first to New York. And so when they first arrived in New York, they were staying with some friends, and they didn't know what to go out and eat, so they just went out to the street, and they saw a long line of people. So like, we should just go there. It looks a lot of people are there, so it must be good. And they didn't know what it was. They saw these strange dishes. Like, I don't know what this is. But they tried it. The man was like, "Which one do you want?" And my grandpa just pointed to random stuff. And then when they tried it, they bit into it and immediately spit it out. Like, "This is disgusting. What is this?" And then they told me it was pizza. They had never had cheese before. That was crazy to me because I think that a pizza is such like, everyone knows what pizza is, but I think that was the perspective in the 80s. Like they hadn't had pizza in Korea before. But now they love pizza during quarantine. My family would drop off pizza sometimes at their house, and they always really looked forward to that. So I look at that now as, they are able to start new traditions in America, deviate from what they had in Korea, but also like learn to adapt and exist in America. As for not your second part of your question, like navigating these difficult conversations, I think it was really tough. Like when I was messaging my uncles, I was like, "Oh, I'm so nervous for them to respond. Like I have to do the interview today." And I think it's really tough for them to recount some of the stories, like especially for my uncles and my mom. I was asking them about what happened when they did come to America. They were the first Asian people in their elementary school. And my mom would tell me stories like how when they go to ELS, my mom would just cry, and then beg to be put in her brother's group, even though she was a 6-year-old being with other like 3rd graders. And that was really like traumatic for her, like being forced to like exist in a classroom in the language that she didn't speak. And then it was really tough. Like my mom was telling me how years later when she was in high school, she had a conversation with her father. And my Hadabuchi was just apologizing to her. "I'm so sorry for putting you in 1st grade when I knew you weren't ready. You were supposed to be a kindergartner, but that was a half-day program. So I had to put you with the 1st graders." So I think that's tough from like my mom's perspective, but also from my parents' perspective. Like seeing your kids go through that is very, very tough as well. But those are the stories that sometimes my mom tells me jokingly about how all she wanted to do was play Candyland and when she was in ELS. But I think there's also a much more serious undertone to that. Did you have a question?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for sharing that. And I definitely echo what Dr. Khan was saying about how much I loved how personal and like how much of your family that you shared in this presentation. I guess I was just curious about like your literature selection. Did you approach this looking for these specific books or looking for books that shared similar themes to your presentation, or did you just stumble upon them in your reading and like felt really connected?
No, it was actually very purposeful. Like I had Dr. Park as a mentor, and she recommended this selection of literature. I was familiar with like Chung Riley before because I'd read previous works by him. So I knew that I wanted to have him in my selection. So I guess that was kind of like my own suggestion. But I'm really glad that I had her as my mentor because she really exposed me to so many works that were very relevant to my work. Were very integral to my process.
Wonderful talk. It's so great to like hear even more about this project after seeing it grow over the summer. I'm also interested in learning a little bit more about what the interviews were like with your cousins, right? Your sisters, like, quote, wow, like, amazing. I wish I could say something like that. So I was just curious if you saw a diversity of perspectives on the American dream with your cousins, and if you have any hypothesis of what might be going on if there is a diversity of perspectives.
Yeah, I think there definitely is a diversity of perspectives just at our different life stages. I noted how I was most excited to talk to my older sister because she's the oldest cousin. There are 9 of us total. We're relatively young. I'm the second oldest, and my youngest cousin was born in 2008, so he's 13 now. I didn't get to interview him. I would have loved to, but he didn't respond to my text. Yeah, I think there was some diversity in opinions based off of our life stages. My older sister is majoring in English and minoring in Asian American Studies, so I think she's very familiar with this subject matter. Whereas my younger sister, who is a senior in high school, you know, she, like me when I was younger, like used to read Asian American literature on her own and kind of process that individually. But she's never had any like formal education about the American dream, so it was really interesting kind of prodding her with questions, asking her what she believed. So I think there is some diversity of opinion, purely, not just purely, but based off our parents, what our parents believe, but also how old we are developmentally.
Other questions or thoughts? Sure. First off, this was really great to see. I took Dr. Khan's class some years ago. I'm now back as a grad student, so it's really great to be here in the ASAM community back again.
Joyce, tell your name.
Oh, my name's Joyce, Kim, by the way. So I'm also identify as Korean American, and my parents are the ones who immigrated from South Korea back in their 20s, and something that I also grew up in Texas, so very different atmosphere in some ways than what I know New Jersey to be. But it sounds like I know your grandparents immigrated, and my experience, I did not encounter many Korean American peers while growing up whose grandparents immigrated here. So there's that multi-generational aspect. So I'd be really curious to hear about your experience as it's reflected through immigration and how that affects your conceptions of what the American dream is.
Yeah, I think I exist in kind of an interesting spot. My parents both immigrated, but they were very young, so they considered themselves like 1.5 generations. So that kind of leaves me in like a weird gray zone in my second generation, my third generation. I'm not really sure. But I think that it definitely has affected my view of immigration a lot because I look at my grandparents primarily rather than like my parents' story. I think that for them, they did all of their growing up in America, or most of their growing up in America. As for like how that impacts my view of the American dream, I think that for a while, like I thought of it primarily as just an American thing. Like it's like white people believe in the American dream, you know, it's the white thing offenses. But I think that once I started looking at it through my own perspective, like through my own lens, like an Asian American lens, you know, you really see how it utilizes concepts like the model minority myth in order to, you know, kind of weaponize Asian Americanness against like the Black community, for example, to show like why certain immigrants groups are like successful and others like are unable to achieve this so-called success. So I think that I look at my grandparents' immigration, and I look at them and I think they're so successful. They have kids who are happy, with families who have secure careers, but I also think that I don't think that was because of the American dream. And I also think that my grandparents, in many cases, were the exception, not the rule. My grandparents also immigrated with a lot of resources that other immigrants don't really have. My maternal grandparents immigrated with English degrees. So they had some English speaking ability when they came to America. Not fluent, but they had ability. My paternal grandparents, my grandfather was an engineer, my grandmother was a nurse. So post 1965, like many other like specialized immigrants, they were able to secure a visa fairly quickly. So I think that I look at my family and I think I look at their success and I can see and congratulate my grandparents on their success. But I think that as for the American dream, I kind of don't necessarily meld the two together. You know, I don't think that my grandparents secured the American dream. I think they're just successful people.
Wait, so do you believe in the American dream?
I don't believe in the American
You
dream.
do not.
No, I do not. I think that it's possible for certain groups to be successful, and I think that there are some caveats to the success, but I don't think it's like a statement that everyone in America can work hard and become successful, because that's just not true. I mean, you can work as hard as you want, but if you're given or not given certain opportunities, that significantly impacts your trajectory in life.
Other thoughts or questions? I also want to invite our friends that are on Zoom, if you would like to put something in the chat or a question or a thought, certainly you're welcome to do that as well. Yes, Lily. Lily.
Yes. Oh.
Oh, okay. Wait, there's a question here too.
Oh.
Hi, Lily. Thank you so much for such a sensitive portrayal and engagement with not only your family's experience, but also the idea of the American dream. And I'm struck that concept, if you look at Google and Graham, which charts word usage over time, it was almost completely not in use prior to World War II. And so it's very much bound up in this post-war consumer economy and the trappings of materiality and consumerism. And I'm struck by your family's redefinition of the American dream in terms of things like education and other sorts of opportunities that are not material, they're not financial. And so I wonder if there's a possibility, instead of thinking about the American dream as this concept that's static and singular, rather than that, thinking about it in terms of a multiplicity of meanings that, you know, it's clear resonate in very meaningful ways for your family. So I was just curious about that and wondering if there was possibility there.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. That was why I was really interested in this project, because my grandparents have always projected that they believe in the American dream. And I think what you said about the American dream otherwise being like seen as like a very more materialistic perspective, like the white picket fence, like living in the suburban like house, you know, single family house. I think for my grandparents, like they wanted those things. They wanted to, you know, have material wealth, but also for them, like my uncle said, like the theme of their life is sacrifice for the further generation. So that is very, you know, you can't hold that. For my grandparents, I think I looked at their definition and kind of compared my definition to that, rather than like the materialistic perspective, I guess. And I was really interested in this because I do think the notion of American dream can mold and shift with different generations. I think that it's really interesting how the American dream continues to be so resiliently portrayed in our media as like a dream for everyone, even though life in 2021 is drastically different from life like post World War II. And so that's why I was interested in asking my aunts, my mom, and my cousins what they believe the American dream was. And I think that like for my uncles and my mom, I was asking them like, when does this dream stop? When do our individual dreams begin? There's no really clear answer to that. I think that my the way my uncle described it was, 할머니, 할아버지 are just on the sidelines. They just got us into this game, and now like your uncles, your mom, like we can be like kind of players. We can like be doctors, but we want for you guys to be the heads of the hospital, maybe be a central figure. So I think for my family, like I don't know when the American dream stops, because I don't think that it ever will for us. But it's a really interesting question.
Well, so this is being recorded. Are you gonna share this with your family?
I think I will. My mom says she wanted to tune in. I don't know if she's actually on it. She wanted to come here physically, but I had to set some boundaries.
What if we would have all loved to have met her?
But I think I will. Yeah, I think that my grandparents would probably like to watch this.
Yeah. Great. Any last thoughts? No? All right, well, Lily, thank you so much for such a fabulous sharing this with us as well. And